Face it, Lorraine. You're what, 62? Dad's real family is here now. My stepson Bradley sneered across the lawyer's mahogany desk, his sister Vanessa nodding in agreement. They'd spent 6 months planning this moment, convinced their father's will would erase me like I'd never existed. 22 years of marriage reduced to nothing in their minds. Mr. Pemberton, the estate attorney, cleared his throat and opened the folder. Actually, he said quietly, we need to discuss the 2019 amendment your father made, the one naming Lorraine as primary beneficiary and executor of the entire estate. Before we dive into this story, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you are in the world. And please hit that like button for me right now and subscribe to my channel. We're building a community of people who refuse to be silenced, who know that dignity has no expiration date. Now back to my story. They told me I was too old to matter. 62 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office while my dead husband's children looked at me like I was dirt. They couldn't wait to scrape off their expensive shoes. That's where this story reaches its breaking point. But that's not where it begins. No. This begins 22 years earlier, when I was stupid enough to believe that love and patience could win over people who'd already decided to hate me. My name is Lorraine Chen, and I want you to understand something right now. I'm not the villain in this story, but I'm not some helpless victim either. What I am is a woman who spent 2 decades playing nice with people who were plotting against me from day one. And when my husband Walter died, when they finally thought they'd won, that's when they discovered exactly who they'd been underestimating all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, to 1997, to a medical conference in Chicago, to the moment I met the man who would change my life in ways I never saw coming. I was 40 years old, standing on a stage in front of 300 physicians, delivering the keynote address on pediatric oncology research. I'd spent 15 years clawing my way up in a field that didn't particularly want women, especially not Asian women, who refused to smile and nod their way through systematic dismissal. That conference was my arrival moment, the validation that I knew what I was talking about, that I'd earned my place at that podium. Walter Prescott was sitting in the 3rd row. I noticed him because while everyone else was scribbling notes or checking their watches, he was completely focused, his eyes sharp with genuine interest. 58 years old, silver hair, good suit, and something in his face that looked like intelligence mixed with sadness. I'd learn later that his wife Margaret had died of cancer 8 months earlier, and my presentation on pediatric treatment protocols had reminded him of everything he'd watched her endure. He approached me after, and here's what I remember most. He didn't lead with a compliment about my appearance or some patronizing comment about being impressed for someone so young. He asked me a genuine question about lymphoma treatment resistance. We talked for 40 minutes about cellular biology and immunotherapy, and somewhere in that conversation, I forgot I was supposed to be networking and just enjoyed talking to someone who understood what I was saying. Our first date was 3 weeks later. He flew to Boston where I was working. We had dinner at a quiet Italian place in the North End, and he did something that should have been a red flag but felt like relief. He talked about Margaret, honestly, without the performative grief that people use to seem deep. He told me about their 35 years together, about her brilliance and her humor, about the hole her death had left. And I didn't do what I'd done with other men who were clearly not over their exes. I didn't run. Because Walter wasn't comparing me to a ghost. He was simply being honest about his life. I'm not looking to replace her, he told me over tiramisu. I'm looking to figure out what the rest of my life looks like. And I'd like you to be part of discovering that, if you're interested. I was interested. God help me, I was interested. The problem started the moment he introduced me to his children. Bradley was 23. Fresh out of business school with his father's company awaiting him like a throne. Vanessa was 21, still in college but already carrying herself like someone who'd never heard the word no applied to her personally. And both of them looked at me across Walter's dining room table like I was an insult to their mother's memory gift wrapped in a too young package. Never mind that I was a 40-year-old doctor with my own career and money. Never mind that I'd met their father a full 8 months after his wife's death, a respectful amount of time by anyone's standards. Never mind that I went out of my way to acknowledge Margaret, to respect her place in Walter's history, to never act like I was trying to erase her. None of it mattered. To Bradley and Vanessa, I was the woman who'd trapped their grieving father. I was the outsider who'd invaded their family. I was the threat to their inheritance, though they'd never say that part out loud. That first dinner, Vanessa made sure every family photo in the house was positioned where I couldn't miss it. Margaret's face smiled at me from every surface, the mantel, the side tables, the wall behind where I sat. It was territorial marking disguised as memory keeping. Bradley asked me pointed questions about my family background, my education, my intentions, like I was a suspect in an interrogation room rather than a guest in his father's home. I should have seen it then. I should have recognized the steel behind their polite smiles, the calculation in how they positioned themselves between Walter and me at every opportunity. But I was in love, and Walter was in love with me, and I genuinely believed that time and patience would soften them. I was so stupidly optimistic. Walter and I married 6 months later, a small ceremony that Bradley and Vanessa attended with faces like they were at a funeral instead of a wedding. I didn't push for a big celebration. I understood this was complicated for them, that they needed time to adjust. So we kept it simple, intimate, just a few close friends and Walter's brother Daniel, who seemed genuinely happy for us before he mysteriously disappeared from Walter's life 5 years later, for reasons I wouldn't understand until much later. And then began 22 years of me trying to build a bridge to people who were busy burning it from their end. I remembered birthdays. They forgot. When Bradley turned 25 and Walter looked sad that his son hadn't called, I reminded Bradley 3 days before and helped Walter plan a surprise dinner. When Vanessa graduated from college and was too busy with her friends to celebrate with her father, I organized a small party at the house and made sure all her favorite foods were there. When holidays came around, I was the one coordinating schedules, sending reminders, trying to gather the family Walter so desperately wanted to keep intact. I encouraged Walter to help them financially. When Bradley's first business venture, some revolutionary app that was going to disrupt the entertainment industry, predictably failed in 2008, burning through $300,000 of investor money, I was the one who told Walter it was okay to bail him out. "He's young," I said. "He's learning. That's what fathers do." When Vanessa's boutique clothing store collapsed after 2 years in 2012, hemorrhaging money because she'd chosen the most expensive location in the city and never bothered to learn basic business management, I encouraged Walter to cover her debts. "She's your daughter," I reminded him when he worried about enabling her. Family supports family. I honored Margaret's memory at every opportunity. On the anniversary of her death, I made sure Walter visited her grave, and I never acted like I was in competition with a woman who'd given him 35 years and 2 children. When Bradley and Vanessa wanted to keep their mother's china, her jewelry, her personal effects, I didn't object. When they wanted to keep her photos up in the house, I welcomed it. I understood that she was part of Walter's history, part of who he was, and I never asked him to choose between his past and his present. But here's what I didn't understand then, what took me years to fully grasp. Nothing I did would ever be enough, because they didn't hate me for what I'd done. They hated me for existing, for daring to make their father happy again, for representing the fact that their mother was truly gone and life was moving forward without her. The years passed, and their visits became less frequent, more obligatory. Holidays turned into duty calls. Phone conversations with Walter grew shorter, punctuated by excuses about being busy, about work commitments, about other plans. And I watched my husband's face grow sadder with each cancellation, each forgotten birthday, each interaction that felt more like checking a box than genuine connection. I gave up a job opportunity for them once. In 2015, I was offered the position of hospital director in Boston, a dream role that would have meant a significant salary increase and the kind of professional recognition I'd worked toward for decades. But it would have required relocating, and Walter's children were in Philadelphia, and he wanted to stay close to them even though they barely made time for him. So I turned it down. I stayed. I kept trying. Looking back, I can see myself so clearly in those years, a woman performing patience like it was an Olympic sport, convincing myself that my grace and understanding would eventually break through their wall of resentment. I was so focused on being the bigger person that I didn't notice they were using my goodness as a weapon against me. And then Walter had his heart attack. It happened on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 months before that will reading I mentioned at the start. We were having breakfast, planning a weekend trip to the shore, and Walter just collapsed. One moment he was laughing at something I'd said, reaching for his coffee, and the next he was on the floor, his face gray, his breathing shallow. I performed CPR. I called 911. I did everything my medical training had prepared me for, and in the ambulance, holding his hand while the paramedics worked, I begged him not to leave me. "Stay," I whispered. "Please stay." He died 3 hours later in the hospital. Massive myocardial infarction. His heart had simply given out, and mine shattered. The funeral was 4 days later. I moved through it in a fog, accepting condolences from people whose faces I barely registered, listening to the minister talk about Walter's life and legacy, watching Bradley and Vanessa perform the role of grieving children with Oscar-worthy dedication. They stood on either side of the casket like guards, like they were protecting their father from me, even in death. After the service, while people were still milling around offering their sympathies, Vanessa approached me. She was wearing black Chanel and her mother's pearl necklace, and her face had this expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "Lorraine," she said, her voice quiet enough that others wouldn't overhear. "I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss practical matters. When do you think you'll be able to clear out of the house?" I stared at her. My husband, her father, wasn't even in the ground yet, and she was asking when I'd be leaving the home I'd shared with him for 22 years. "Clear out?" I repeated, not quite believing what I was hearing. "Well, yes, the house was Dad's, and obviously it'll need to be part of the estate settlement. Bradley and I thought it would be easier for everyone if you started making arrangements sooner rather than later. We can help you find a nice condo somewhere, something more appropriate for a woman on her own." The words hung in the air between us. Something more appropriate. Translation. Something smaller, cheaper, less than what I'd had. Know your place. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just walked away feeling like I'd been slapped. 1 week later, an envelope arrived at the house. Law offices of Marcus, Fitch, and Browning. Inside was a letter from Bradley's attorney, suggesting that I accept a reasonable settlement to avoid protracted litigation regarding the estate. They were offering me $200,000 to walk away from everything Walter and I had built together. $200,000. Out of an estate worth millions. The letter was professionally worded, full of legal language about avoiding unnecessary conflict and reaching an amicable resolution. But the message underneath was clear. Take this money and disappear. Don't fight us. You can't win. I sat at Walter's desk, my desk now, though they didn't know that yet, and read the letter 3 times. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage, because they'd started this campaign exactly 1 week after their father's death. They hadn't even waited for the earth to settle on his grave before trying to erase me from his life, from his home, from his legacy. And that's when I made my decision. I wouldn't respond to the letter. I wouldn't engage with their threats or their offers. I would trust Walter. I would trust that the man who'd loved me for 22 years had prepared for exactly this moment. I would wait for the will reading, and I would let them dig their own graves with their arrogance. But I had no idea just how deep those graves would go, or what secrets Walter had kept to protect me. I need you to understand something about Bradley and Vanessa Prescott. They weren't stupid. Entitled, yes. Cruel, absolutely. But stupid? No. They'd spent their entire lives watching their father build business empires through strategy and patience, and they'd learned from him even if they'd never matched his integrity. So when they came for me, they didn't come with obvious attacks that I could defend against. They came with whispers. It started with the neighbors, Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down, who'd invited me to her garden parties for 15 years, suddenly became cool when I saw her at the grocery store. She gave me this tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Oh, Lorraine, I didn't see you there." Then she hurried away like I was contagious. 2 days later, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, no relation, just happened to share my last name, canceled our standing dinner plans. "We're just so busy right now," Mrs. Chen said over the phone, her voice strained with something that sounded like pity mixed with judgment. I didn't understand what was happening until I ran into Margaret Sullivan at the pharmacy. Margaret, and yes, the shared name with Walter's first wife always created an awkward moment, had been my friend since I'd moved into the neighborhood. We'd done book club together. We'd gone to yoga classes. We'd shared wine on difficult evenings and celebrated each other's victories. She saw me reaching for my prescription and actually flinched. "Margaret?" I said, confused by her reaction. She looked around the pharmacy like she was checking if anyone was watching, then leaned in close. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Lorraine, I'm sorry, but I can't be seen talking to you right now. Bradley and Vanessa came by last week. They're telling everyone that you took advantage of their father, that he wasn't in his right mind the last few years, that you isolated him from his family." The prescription bottle almost slipped from my hands. "What?" "They said they're just worried about protecting other elderly people from predators, and they wanted the community to be aware. They were very convincing, Lorraine. Very concerned." She glanced toward the door again. "I'm not saying I believe them, but you know how people talk, and right now everyone's talking about you." She left before I could respond, scurrying away like association with me might damage her reputation. I stood there in the pharmacy, surrounded by strangers who were suddenly looking at me differently, and realized with crystalline clarity that this wasn't random coldness. This was strategy. They were destroying my reputation before the will was even read. They were making sure that if I did fight back, the entire community would already believe I was the villain. But that was just the beginning. 3 days later, I logged into Facebook, something I rarely did, but I'd gotten a notification that multiple people had tagged me in posts. What I found made my stomach turn. Vanessa had written a long, emotional post about the painful reality of watching elderly parents fall victim to manipulation. She never mentioned my name. She was too smart for that. But she mentioned her father's sudden marriage later in life, his withdrawal from his children, and her concern about predatory behavior targeting vulnerable widowers. The post had 200 likes, 50 comments, people sharing their own stories about elderly relatives being taken advantage of by new partners, people praising Vanessa for her bravery in speaking out, people offering support during her difficult time. I read every comment, my hands gripping my phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack. And the most horrifying part? Some of these people knew me. Some of them had been to my house, had eaten at my table, had smiled to my face while Walter was alive. And now they were nodding along, agreeing that yes, these things do happen. How terrible. That poor family. Vanessa had weaponized social media with the skill of someone who understood exactly how quickly poison spreads online. She'd created a narrative where she was the protective daughter, and I was the unnamed villain. And she'd done it in a way that made her look sympathetic rather than vindictive. Have you ever watched your entire reputation disintegrate in real time? Have you ever seen people you thought were friends turn into strangers based on lies someone else told about you? Because that's what those weeks felt like, watching my life get edited into a story where I was the antagonist and being powerless to stop it. The country club incident happened on a Saturday afternoon. I'd been a member for 12 years, thanks to Walter's membership that extended to spouses. I went there to swim, to use the gym, to occasionally have lunch with the friends I'd made over the years. It was one of the few places that still felt normal after Walter's death, one of the few routines I could cling to. I walked into the dining room looking for Sarah and Patricia, two women I'd known since 2010, who'd been texting me condolences and support since the funeral. They were sitting at our usual table by the window, and when they saw me approach, something flickered across their faces. Discomfort? Embarrassment? "Lorraine," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. "We didn't know you were coming today." "It's Saturday," I said, confused. "We always have lunch on Saturdays." Patricia wouldn't meet my eyes. She was studying her salad like it contained the secrets of the universe. Sarah cleared her throat. "Listen, we've been hearing some things about you and Walter, about the circumstances of your marriage, and we think it might be better if we took some space for a while." "Space," I repeated flatly. "From what?" "From the drama," Sarah said, and there was an edge to her voice now, like I was being unreasonable for not understanding. "Bradley Prescott is on the club board, Lorraine, and his sister has been very vocal about family concerns. We don't want to be in the middle of whatever's happening between you and them." They chose sides, right there, in the middle of the country club dining room. They chose to believe a man they barely knew over me, someone they'd shared hundreds of lunches with. They chose safety over loyalty, comfort over truth. I left without ordering. I walked through that club with my head high and my spine straight, feeling eyes on me from every table, hearing the whispers that followed in my wake. And when I got to my car, I sat in the driver's seat and let myself shake. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them that. Instead, I did what I'd been doing since Walter's death. I documented everything, every interaction, every cold shoulder, every whispered conversation that ended when I walked into a room. I took screenshots of Vanessa's social media posts before she could delete them. I kept the letter from Bradley's attorney. I noted dates and times and witnesses, because Walter had taught me something during our 22 years together. Evidence matters more than emotion. Facts trump feelings. And if this was going to be a war, I needed ammunition. But then they escalated in a way I didn't see coming. They came for my career. I'd been working at Philadelphia General Hospital for 18 years, longer than I'd been married to Walter. I was a respected pediatric oncologist, someone parents requested by name when their children were diagnosed with cancer. My work was the one part of my life that had remained untouched by the Prescott family drama, the one place where I was just Dr. Chen, where my competence and compassion mattered more than who I'd married. Until Bradley made a phone call to his golf buddy, who happened to sit on the hospital board of directors. I was called into a meeting with the hospital administrator on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Richard Walsh, a man I'd worked with for nearly 2 decades, couldn't look at me directly as he delivered the news. "Lorraine, we've received some concerning information about your personal situation. There are questions being raised about potential conflicts of interest, about your judgment during your late husband's final years, about whether your personal circumstances might impact your professional performance." I sat across from him in his sterile office, surrounded by his medical degrees and certificates of achievement, and felt something cold settle into my chest. "What specifically are you referring to, Richard?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There's a suggestion that you may have entered into your marriage for financial gain, rather than genuine partnership, that you may have isolated your husband from his family, that there were concerns about his mental capacity that you failed to report or address appropriately." "And who made these suggestions?" I asked, though I already knew. "The source has asked to remain confidential, but given the seriousness of the allegations, we feel it's prudent to place you on voluntary leave pending a thorough review of your conduct." Voluntary. That word was doing a lot of work. We both knew it wasn't voluntary at all. "How long?" My voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. "Indefinitely, until the review is complete." I stood up, smoothed my white coat, the coat I'd earned through years of brutal residencies and countless sleepless nights, fighting to save children's lives, and looked Richard Walsh directly in the eye. For the record, these allegations are false, defamatory, and clearly part of a coordinated campaign by my late husband's adult children who are unhappy with his estate plans. I'll cooperate with your review, and I expect a full apology when you discover you've been manipulated. I walked out of that office with my head high, but inside I was screaming, because Bradley and Vanessa hadn't just attacked my reputation or my social standing. They'd attacked the core of who I was, my career, my purpose, the work I'd dedicated my entire adult life to building. And the most insidious part? They'd done it in a way that made the hospital look like they were being responsible and cautious, rather than reactive and cowardly. One phone call from a board member with concerns, and suddenly 18 years of exemplary service meant nothing. I drove home that afternoon wondering how much more they could take from me. I'd lost my husband. I'd lost my friends. I'd lost my standing in the community. Now I'd lost my job. What was left? The house. They wanted the house. That became clear when I pulled into my driveway and found Vanessa's Mercedes parked at the curb. She was standing on my front porch with two men in polo shirts. Movers, I realized, from the local company whose truck was parked behind her car. I got out of my car slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with Vanessa across the lawn. She had this expression on her face, triumphant and pitying at the same time, like she was doing me a favor by orchestrating my humiliation. "What are you doing, Vanessa?" "Making this easier for everyone," she said smoothly, gesturing to the movers. "We thought it would be less stressful if we helped you pack your personal items. You can take whatever's yours, clothes, photographs, that sort of thing. We'll handle the rest." The audacity of it literally took my breath away. She was standing on the porch of the house I'd lived in for 22 years, the house where I'd nursed Walter through his final illness, the house filled with our memories and our life together, and she was offering to let me take my clothes. "This is my home," I said, and my voice was dangerously quiet. "It was Dad's home," Vanessa corrected, "and now it's part of his estate. Bradley and I are prepared to make you a very generous offer to avoid litigation. But we need you to be reasonable, Lorraine. You're 62 years old. You're alone. This house is too big for one person, and frankly, the property taxes alone would bankrupt you without Dad's income." She was so confident, so absolutely certain that she had all the power, that I had no choice but to comply with whatever crumbs she decided to throw at me. She'd probably spent the morning mentally redecorating, deciding which rooms would be hers and which would be Bradley's when they sold the place and split the profits. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "What are you doing?" Vanessa's confidence flickered for the first time. "Hi. Yes, I need to report a trespassing situation," I said calmly into the phone. "I have individuals on my property attempting to remove belongings without my permission or legal authority." Vanessa's face went white, then red. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. This is my home. You have no legal right to be here. And you certainly have no right to enter with movers. The police are on their way, and I suggest you leave before they arrive." The movers were already backing away, clearly not interested in being part of whatever drama this was turning into. Vanessa stood her ground for another moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and then she leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "You think you're protected because you were married to my father? You're 62 years old and alone, Lorraine. This house, his money, his legacy, that's all you have. We can wait you out. We can make your life so miserable that you'll beg to take whatever settlement we offer just to make it stop." She left before the police arrived, but her words stayed with me. Because she wasn't wrong about one thing. I was alone. Walter was gone. My friends had abandoned me. My career was on hold. I had this house and whatever legal protections Walter had left me, and I had no idea if that would be enough. That night, I sat in Walter's reading chair, his favorite spot where he'd spent countless evenings with his books and his brandy, and I almost gave up, almost called Bradley's attorney and said, "Fine, I'll take the settlement. I'll walk away. I'll let you win." But then I remembered something Walter had told me once, during one of our late-night conversations about his children. We'd been married for maybe 5 years, and I'd been frustrated because Bradley had borrowed money for another failed venture and hadn't even said thank you. Walter had sighed, looking older than his years, and said, "Lorraine, I've made mistakes with them. I gave them everything too easily. I never made them face consequences for their choices, and now I don't know how to fix it without breaking what's left of our relationship." I told him it wasn't too late, that they could still learn, that love could bridge any gap. I'd believed that then. God, I'd been naive, but sitting in that chair, surrounded by the darkness of the house and the weight of everything that had happened, I realized something else. Walter had known. He'd known they wouldn't change. He'd known they would come for me after he was gone, and he'd made preparations. I just had to trust him. I just had to hold on long enough to see what he'd put in place. The call from Daniel Prescott came 2 days later, and it was the first unexpected good thing that had happened since Walter's death. "Lorraine, this is Daniel, Walter's brother. I know we haven't spoken in years, but I need to talk to you. Can we meet somewhere private?" I'd almost forgotten about Daniel. He'd been at our wedding, warm and genuine, telling me I was good for his brother. But then, maybe 5 years into our marriage, there'd been some kind of argument between him and Walter. I never knew the details, and Daniel had essentially disappeared from the family. Walter never talked about what happened, and I'd learned not to push. We met at a small cafe 40 minutes outside the city, away from anywhere the Prescott children might have eyes. Daniel looked older than I remembered, 60 now, with gray threading through his dark hair, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as he studied me across the table. "You're going through hell right now," he said, without preamble. "Bradley and Vanessa are making sure of it." "You've been keeping track?" I asked carefully. "Oh, I've been keeping very close track, because Bradley tried to pull the same shit with me that he's pulling with you, just in a different way." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Last year, he called me out of the blue. First time I'd heard from him in over a decade. Said he was starting a new business venture and wondered if I'd be interested in investing. When I said no, when I told him I didn't have that kind of liquid capital, he got nasty. Threatened to tell people I'd stolen from the family business years ago, the lie that caused the rift between Walter and me in the first place. "Did you?" I had to ask. Daniel smiled grimly. "No. But Bradley manufactured evidence that suggested I had, and Walter believed him because he wanted to believe his son was honest. It took me years to gather proof of what really happened, that Bradley had been stealing from the company accounts and had framed me to cover his tracks. By the time I had everything documented, Walter and I hadn't spoken in so long I didn't know how to bridge that gap." My heart started beating faster. "You have proof that Bradley was stealing?" "I have proof that Bradley has been systematically stealing from your late husband's businesses for years. And when I started investigating, I found Vanessa's fingerprints all over it too. Consulting fees for work she never did. Expense accounts that funded her lifestyle. They've been bleeding Walter dry for the better part of a decade." He pulled out a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. Inside were financial documents, bank statements, forensic accounting reports. A paper trail that showed exactly what Bradley and Vanessa had been doing. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Because Walter and I reconciled 2 years before he died, secretly. He reached out after he'd discovered what his children were doing, after he'd confirmed what I'd been telling him all along. We met, we talked, we rebuilt what they'd destroyed, and he told me about you, Lorraine. He told me that you were the only person in his life who'd never asked him for anything, who'd loved him without agenda, who'd stayed through everything his children put you through." Daniel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should watch out for you, because he knew they'd come after you with everything they had." I stared at the documents in front of me, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. He knew. All along he knew what they were going to do. He knew, and he prepared for it. I'm here to help you fight back, Lorraine, because those two don't just deserve to lose their inheritance. They deserve to face consequences for what they've done. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grief and exhaustion. I felt hope, and underneath that hope, I felt anger, clean, righteous anger that had been building for 22 years and finally had a target. But before I could fully process what Daniel was offering, my phone rang. The hospital. Richard Walsh's number. I answered, expecting more bad news. Instead, Richard said, "Lorraine, I need to tell you something. The complaint that was filed against you, we've discovered it was entirely fabricated. No specific incidents, no credible concerns, just vague allegations that don't hold up to any scrutiny. The board member who passed it along has recused himself from the review after we discovered his personal relationship with your stepson. We're formally ending the investigation and asking you to return to work next Monday." I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. "Thank you, Richard. I'm sorry it went this far. We should have done our due diligence before taking action. For what it's worth, everyone who works with you knew the allegations were baseless. Your reputation with your colleagues never wavered." After I hung up, Daniel was watching me with a knowing expression. "Good news. The hospital investigation is over. They figured out Bradley was behind it." "They're desperate," Daniel said. "They're making mistakes. They thought they could blitz you, overwhelm you, make you fold before you had time to mount a defense. But you're still standing, and that's making them sloppy." He was right. I could feel it now, the shift in momentum. They'd overplayed their hand. They'd attacked me on too many fronts too quickly, and in doing so, they'd left evidence of their coordination, proof of their malicious intent. "Tell me about the will reading," Daniel said. "When is it scheduled?" 2 weeks from tomorrow. Perfect. That gives us time to prepare. Because when you walk into that lawyer's office, Lorraine, you're not going to be the grieving widow they're expecting. You're going to be the executor of an estate that's about to destroy them." I looked at Walter's brother, this man who'd been exiled from the family for telling the truth, who'd spent years gathering evidence that would ultimately vindicate him. And I understood then what Walter had been doing in those final years. He hadn't just been protecting me. He'd been setting a trap that was about to spring shut on two people who'd underestimated both their father and the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. The 2 weeks before the will reading passed like a slow-motion avalanche, inevitable, unstoppable, and heading straight for Bradley and Vanessa Prescott with the full force of their own arrogance behind it. Daniel and I met every other day, usually at that same cafe outside the city, going over every document, every piece of evidence, every strategic move Walter had made in those final 3 years of his life. And with each meeting, I understood more clearly that my husband hadn't just loved me. He'd protected me with the precision of a man who'd spent his entire career outmaneuvering competitors and building empires from nothing. The forensic accounting reports Daniel had were just the beginning. Walter had commissioned them himself in 2019 after noticing irregularities in his business accounts that even his experienced eye couldn't explain away. $340,000, siphoned off over 5 years through fake consulting fees, inflated expense reports, and direct transfers that Bradley had authorized using his position in the company. Vanessa's boutique had been funded entirely with stolen money, and when it failed, she'd simply moved on to other creative ways of draining her father's accounts. But here's what broke my heart when I read through Walter's notes in his own handwriting. He'd given them chances to confess, multiple chances. He'd brought up financial concerns in casual conversations, mentioned discrepancies he'd noticed, created opportunities for them to come clean. They'd lied to his face every single time, with the kind of ease that comes from years of practice. And that's when Walter made his decision. Not in anger, but in that cold, clear-eyed way that had made him successful in business. He revised his will, set up the no contest clause, and wrote a letter explaining exactly why he was doing what he was doing. Then he'd recorded a video testimony with his attorney, making sure there could be no question about his mental capacity or his intentions. He was protecting you, Daniel told me, but he was also finally being a father. The kind of father who sets boundaries and enforces consequences, even when it hurts. The morning of the will reading, I woke up at 5 a.m. in Walter's reading chair, where I'd apparently fallen asleep, going over documents one more time. My neck ached and my mouth was dry, but my mind was crystalline clear. This was the day. After 6 months of grief and attack and endurance, this was finally the day. I dressed carefully, a navy suit that Walter had always said made me look powerful. Pearl earrings he'd given me on our 10th anniversary. Minimal makeup. I wasn't dressing for a funeral anymore. I was dressing for war, and I intended to look like someone who'd already won. The law offices of Pemberton and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a building in downtown Philadelphia, all mahogany and leather, and the kind of expensive quiet that only comes with old money and older partnerships. Mr. Pemberton had been Walter's attorney for 30 years, had drafted both his wills, the one before me and the one that would be read today. I arrived 15 minutes early. Bradley and Vanessa were already there, sitting in the waiting area with their attorney, Marcus Fitch, a shark in a $3,000 suit who specialized in contesting estates and breaking wills that families didn't like. They'd brought him as intimidation, as a show of force. Vanessa was wearing her mother's pearls again. Bradley had Walter's watch on his wrist, the Rolex Walter had worn every day of our marriage. They'd already helped themselves to his belongings, so confident in their victory that they were literally wearing their inheritance before it was legally theirs. When they saw me walk in, Bradley's face twisted into something ugly. "Face it, Lorraine. You're what, 62? Dad's real family is here now." I didn't respond. I just smiled at him, the kind of smile that says, "I know something you don't," and watched him shift uncomfortably in his leather chair. Mr. Pemberton's secretary led us into the conference room at exactly 10 a.m. The space was dominated by a massive table, windows overlooking the city, and a sense of finality that made my heart pound. We took our seats, Bradley and Vanessa on one side with Marcus Fitch, me on the other with my attorney Sarah Kim, who Daniel had helped me find. Sarah was in her 50s, built like a dancer, with eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for demolishing opposing counsel with surgical precision. Mr. Pemberton entered last, carrying a folder that contained the end of Bradley and Vanessa's world, though they didn't know it yet. He was 70, dignified, with the kind of gravitas that comes from decades of dealing with families at their worst. "Thank you all for being here," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We're here for the reading of Walter Prescott's last will and testament, executed on March 15th, 2019, and properly witnessed and notarized according to Pennsylvania state law." Marcus Fitch cleared his throat importantly. "Before we proceed, I'd like to note that my clients have concerns about the validity of any recent amendments to Mr. Prescott's will, particularly any made in the last 5 years of his life, when he may have been under undue influence." "Noted," Mr. Pemberton said evenly. "However, I should inform you that Mr. Prescott specifically anticipated such challenges and took extraordinary measures to ensure his wishes would be legally unassailable. Shall we proceed?" Bradley leaned forward. "Just read it. Let's get this over with." And so Mr. Pemberton began reading. The standard legal language first. Sound mind, disposing memory, not under undue influence. Then the specifics. "To my son, Bradley Prescott, I leave the sum of $1 and my disappointment. To my daughter, Vanessa Prescott, I leave the sum of $1 and my sorrow." The silence in that room was absolute. Vanessa's face went white. Bradley's went purple. "What the fuck?" Bradley started, but Marcus Fitch put a hand on his arm. Mr. Pemberton continued, his voice steady. "The remainder of my estate, including but not limited to my residence at 2847 Laurel Heights Drive, my investment portfolio currently valued at approximately $8 million, my shares in Prescott Pharmaceuticals, Prescott Holdings, and Prescott Ventures, and all other assets not specifically bequeathed, I leave to my wife, Lorraine Chen Prescott, who has been my partner, my confidant, and my joy for 22 years. Furthermore, he continued, and I could hear the slight emphasis he placed on the word, I name Lorraine Chen Prescott as executor of my estate, with full discretionary power over all assets and their distribution. Bradley exploded out of his chair. This is fraud. She manipulated him, isolated him from his family, poisoned him against his own children. Mr. Prescott, Mr. Pemberton said quietly, and something in his tone made Bradley stop. Your father anticipated your reaction. He anticipated all of this, which is why he prepared a detailed explanation of his decisions, which I'm now required to read to you. He pulled out a second document, and I recognized Walter's handwriting on the pages. My throat tightened. This letter is dated March 15th, 2019, the same day as the will amendment. Your father wrote, To my children, if you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone and you're contesting my final wishes. I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you comes not from anger, but from heartbreak. Mr. Pemberton's voice wavered slightly, then steadied. In 2016, I began noticing financial irregularities in my company accounts, small amounts at first, amounts I thought might be errors or legitimate expenses I'd forgotten authorizing. But they continued, and they grew larger, so I hired a forensic accountant to investigate. Vanessa made a small sound, like a trapped animal. Bradley's hands were clenched into fists on the table. What I discovered devastated me, Mr. Pemberton continued reading. Over a period of 5 years, you had systematically stolen from me. Bradley, you authorized transfers to shell companies you controlled. Vanessa, you billed for consulting services you never provided. Together, you took $340,000 from the businesses I built, the legacy I hoped to leave you. Marcus Fitch was already reaching for his briefcase, pulling out papers, but I could see the defeat in his posture. He knew what was coming. I gave you chances to confess, Walter's letter continued. I brought up concerns. I created opportunities for honesty. You lied to me every time, and that's when I realized that you didn't see me as your father. You saw me as a resource to be exploited. I watched tears stream down Vanessa's face, but they were tears of rage and humiliation, not remorse. Bradley was staring at the wall, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. So I made changes, Mr. Pemberton read, not to punish you, but to protect the one person in my life who never asked me for anything, my wife, Lorraine. She encouraged me to help you when you needed it. She remembered your birthdays when you forgot mine. She honored your mother's memory when you weaponized it against her. And when you inevitably turn on her after my death, as I know you will, these documents will protect her from your cruelty. The letter concluded with Walter's final words. I loved you both until my last breath. But love without accountability isn't love. It's enabling. I hope someday you understand that. But more than that, I hope you learn to become people worthy of the second chances you've squandered. Your father, Walter Prescott. The silence after Mr. Pemberton finished reading was suffocating. Then Sarah Kim slid a stack of documents across the table. These are copies of the forensic accounting reports, bank statements, and email communications that support everything in Mr. Prescott's letter. We also have testimony from his accountant, his banker, and his brother Daniel, who can verify the timeline and Mr. Prescott's state of mind throughout this process. There's more, Mr. Pemberton added. In 2016, Mr. Prescott had both of you sign documents acknowledging receipt of loans for your business ventures. Those loans were actually the stolen funds he'd discovered. You signed paperwork essentially confessing to the theft, though you didn't realize it at the time. Bradley's face had gone from purple to gray. He tricked us. He gave you a choice, I said, speaking for the first time. Every head turned toward me. He could have pressed charges. He could have had you arrested for embezzlement. Instead, he revised his will and gave you exactly what you deserved, nothing. Vanessa's voice was hoarse. You turned him against us. No, I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded. You did that yourselves. I spent 22 years encouraging Walter to give you everything you wanted. I reminded him of your birthdays. I pushed him to help you financially. I tried to build bridges you kept burning. And after he died, you proved him right about everything. You tried to erase me before he was even in the ground. I stood up, suddenly feeling lighter than I had in months. The will contains a no contest clause. If you challenge any part of it, you forfeit even the symbolic $1. But please, by all means, let Marcus here file his motions. Let's go through years of litigation where every detail of what you did to your father becomes public record. Marcus Fitch was already packing his briefcase. My clients will need time to consider their options. No, Sarah Kim said. They'll need time to accept reality. The will is ironclad. The evidence is overwhelming, and Mrs. Prescott has additional leverage you should be aware of. She slid one more document across the table. The statute of limitations on embezzlement in Pennsylvania is 5 years from discovery of the crime. Mr. Prescott discovered your theft in 2019. He died in 2024, which means Mrs. Prescott, as executor, has the legal standing to pursue criminal charges if she chooses. Bradley's head snapped up. You wouldn't. I looked at him, this man who'd sneered at me across his father's desk, who'd told me I was too old to matter, who'd spent 6 months trying to destroy everything I'd built. And I smiled. I haven't decided yet, I said. But here's what I have decided. The house stays mine. Every dollar of that $8 million portfolio stays mine, and I'm going to use a significant portion of it to establish 2 charitable foundations. One for pediatric oncology research, named after your mother, Margaret, and one for elder financial abuse prevention, named after your father, Walter. You're setting up charities? Vanessa's voice cracked on the word. I'm building a legacy. Your parents will be remembered for helping people, for making a difference, for leaving the world better than they found it. You'll be remembered as the children who tried to steal from your dying father and failed. I picked up my purse, nodded to Sarah and Mr. Pemberton, and walked toward the door. But before I left, I turned back one last time. You were right about one thing, Bradley. I am 62 years old, but I'm not too old to matter. I'm just old enough to know exactly how little you do. 6 months later, I stood in the ballroom of the Philadelphia Convention Center, watching 300 people gather for the inaugural fundraising gala for the Margaret and Walter Prescott Foundation. The Foundation for Elder Financial Abuse had launched 3 months earlier, and we'd already helped 37 families navigate legal proceedings against children, caregivers, and other relatives who'd stolen from vulnerable seniors. The Pediatric Oncology Research Fund was partnering with my hospital. Yes, I'd been promoted to Chief of Pediatric Oncology. The very position I'd turned down years ago to develop new treatment protocols that would save lives for generations to come. Daniel Prescott was at my side, having rejoined the family properly as the Foundation's advisory board chair. The country club friends who'd abandoned me were scattered throughout the room, their checkbooks open, their guilty consciences apparently expensive. They'd all donated generously, and I'd accepted graciously, because the Foundation needed the money more than I needed to hold grudges. Bradley and Vanessa weren't there, obviously. They'd disappeared from Philadelphia society after the will reading, Bradley to San Diego, Vanessa to Portland. They'd never challenged the will. They'd never pursued litigation. They'd simply vanished, and the story of what they'd done had filled the vacuum they left behind. I'd chosen not to press criminal charges, not out of forgiveness. I wasn't there yet, might never be, but because Walter's letter had been right. The consequences he'd put in place were sufficient. They'd lost their inheritance, their reputation, and their family. That was punishment enough. As I looked around the ballroom at all these people celebrating Walter's name and Margaret's memory, I felt my husband's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. He'd known this would happen. He'd known I'd turn pain into purpose, loss into legacy, and he'd known that the woman his children dismissed as too old to matter would be the one who made his name mean something real. I'm 63 now. I work full-time at the hospital. I run 2 foundations. I've reconnected with friends and made new ones. I travel when I want to. I live in the house I shared with Walter, but it's mine now, filled with my choices and my life. And sometimes late at night, I sit in Walter's reading chair and remember the man who loved me enough to protect me even after he was gone. They thought I was too old to matter, but I was exactly the right age to prove them wrong. So I want to hear from you right now. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age, your gender, your background, or any other reason people use to dismiss someone's worth? Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours against people who thought they could take it? Drop your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to stand up to family members who thought they could steamroll you. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that you're never too old or too young or too anything to matter, hit that subscribe button. Because I've got more stories about people who were underestimated, who were written off, who were told they didn't matter, and who proved everyone wrong. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's going through their own battle, someone who needs to be reminded that patience and strategy beat aggression and entitlement every single time. Leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, because your engagement tells me you want more stories like this, stories about real people fighting real battles and winning on their own terms. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to my story.